Hello. So lately I've been reading a lot about Buddhism. You've probably seen my Instagram posts and some of my book tour videos, library tour videos, where I have all these Eastern philosophy books that have a lean towards Buddhism. And as I was reading the other day, I realized that Buddhism and reading are actually very similar. I always thought like reading was like meditation. It's like a very meditative state. But after coming across some of the more formalized principles of Buddhism and kind of like baking them into my unconscious, I kind of realized that reading and Buddhism are actually very similar, but it's really hard to make the connections at first. So what do I mean by this? One of the first things that you can think about is the idea of like ego death or no self. I think in Buddhism it's not to be taken too literally, but you'll often hear a lot of the teachers, or if you're reading some of the books, talk about like if you're sitting down and meditating, you're just witnessing your thoughts, right? This is like the stage one. This is what you're supposed to aim for. And then the ultimate realization is to realize that the thought of witnessing your thoughts is itself another thought, right? And it's supposed to be complete like emptiness. Sometimes the word is used, like detachment. No self is one of the words I often hear. And I find when I'm reading, if I'm really, really reading, I don't think too much about myself. What will usually happen is within the first 5 or 10 minutes of reading, sometimes I'll have these ideas that come across the page and I'll be like, oh yeah, I was thinking about this the other day. Or, oh, this so-and-so said this the other day. I'll end up relating the ideas back to my social life or some more meaningful memories in my head. But as time goes on, as I hit like the 20-minute marker, the 30-minute marker, especially the 40 or 50-minute marker, it's just, I don't think about myself. I don't have like self-reflection almost. It's just like I'm living inside the pages. I'm completely absorbed into the content that I'm consuming. And so I think that's very similar to actually some of the ideas that are preached inside Eastern philosophy about like no self or like ego death. Another idea is Daoism, or like the Tao. I think it means like the water courseway, like the waterway, like Wu Wei. And the idea here is that you shouldn't force something, that it should be like organic. There's this famous quote that Alan Watts always talks about where he says like, there was a lecturer who was giving a lecture and he said that Tao is like, if you fart at 9 p.m., there's no purpose to it. It just happens spontaneously, right? You're not planning to fart at 9 p.m. So relating that to reading, I feel like the same holds true for reading. When you're reading, there's this temptation to think like, okay, if I read 20 pages a day, I'll finish this book by this day. And you're focused on the end goal of finishing the book. But if you do that, if every time you pick up that book, you're only focused on the end goal of reading the book or of completing the book, you won't actually understand what you're reading. And so that means when you're actually reading, you can't focus on your completion of the book. If you're doing a Pomodoro, you can't focus on getting to the end of the Pomodoro. You have to focus strictly on what's in front of you from moment to moment. You have to really live in the moment in order to understand what it is you're actually reading. And so in that sense, I think also reading is very much like Buddhism. Another way that I think reading is like Buddhism has to do with, I think it's called the Maya, or like the Great Illusion. Lao Tzu has like a quote where he says like the person who sees only 5 colors is blind and the person who hears only 5 tones is deaf. And the idea that he was getting at was that if you use your categories, like your human categories, and force everything you see into your categories, then you're missing what everything actually is, because your categories are never the thing itself. It's only like a partial representation of the thing. It's like an illusion in some sense. And I think Zeno's paradox also you can use to get to this point, but that's like a tangent. Relating this back to reading, when you're reading like say like a book on economics where they're talking about like the labor markets, well, labor markets are never just labor markets. Like if you think about it realistically, there's sociological factors, there's biological factors, there's even factors of just pure like physics, right? There's so many things that are actually involved in the labor market that economics can't talk about. So when you're reading economics, you have to be like really, really aware that it is in some sense illusory. It's partial. It's not really the thing itself. And this holds true for all the fields. Like if you're reading psychology, the content of psychology is more than what psychology can talk about, right? If you're talking about someone's personality traits, well, there's also a brain involved, and that brain has chemical processes and so on and so forth. So it's when you're reading, you have to keep in mind that things are partial representations, not the thing itself, and so it's illusory. And that's a lesson that they teach you a lot in Buddhism. I think in Chinese Buddhism it's really popular, but I think all forms of Buddhism teach it. I think it's called the Maya, the Great Illusion, and that concepts of the mind are illusory and normative. They're not the thing itself. And so reading is very much like that. Now, another one that is really interesting is the lack of permanence. I remember watching like a documentary when I was much younger. This one I've known for a while, It was watching this documentary of these monks who were creating these intricate sand sculptures, and then the tide would come in and wash them away, and the sand sculptures would take them like hours, right? It took them a very long time, and it'd be like a very beautiful piece of work, and then it would get washed away. And the idea here was to like physically embody the notion of that things aren't permanent, that things are in a constant state of change, and there's a lack of permanence. Now, when you're reading, the same thing holds true. You could spend like 150 hours reading like the hardest biology textbook out there, right? 150 hours. And now you feel like you've really built up this really, really robust intellectual framework in biology. And then 3 years later, something comes out and like negates 75% of the content inside that biology textbook. And that's what happens when you read nonfiction books, at least, is the frameworks that you adopt are always tentative. And you could even say that, like, to some extent, Karl Popper, as a book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, is arguing for this. It's very similar to Eastern philosophy in that regard. Because what Popper says is, since we don't have a solution to the Munchausen's trilemma, what we can instead do is make an assertion and then try our very best to debunk that assertion. So things are like tentatively the case until we can prove that they aren't. We shouldn't think that things are the case and then use that as like a way to, like, you use our experiments to prove things that as being the case. We should do our experiments to prove things aren't the case. So like the whole Black Crow thought experiment, right? And reading is very much like that. Like a lot of the ideas you're going to have will just be temporary truths at best, if you can even call it that. They're going to be partial, but they're going to be temporary. And you're going to have to get used to the lack of permanence if you want to read nonfiction books for the rest of your life. Like the goal of nonfiction books isn't to just read one book on, let's say, political science or physics, and then have a universal truth for the rest of your life. That's not the goal. The last idea I want to mention is that in Buddhism, there's this notion that the consequences of living will be suffering. And I think the same thing holds true for reading. It's not a one-to-one match in this case, but it's pretty similar. Like if you read a lot of nonfiction, some of the consequences of reading a lot of nonfiction, maybe even fiction, is going to be suffering. Like you might become unrelatable to other people. You might lose your interest in other people. You might develop like an allergy to small talk. You might find a lot of people are just like really boring because, especially if you've been reading books for like 10 years, a lot of the ideas that ordinary people have, or let's say non-readers, aren't that unique. They're usually part of some kind of zeitgeist or some kind of large demographic where the beliefs are super common and prevalent. They're not super niche, right? Like the average person isn't going to be espousing Julius Evola philosophy or Engels and Marx on German ideology, right? They're not going to be talking about that. So you're going to run into a lot of repetitive beliefs when you're talking to normal people. And that might bore you, actually. One of the consequences of reading might be that. Another consequence might be like arrogance. I've seen my fair share of people, it tends to be younger people, who when they read become entitled, or not entitled, maybe they develop a sense of superiority. They think they're smarter because maybe they have this belief that reading makes you like quote unquote higher IQ or something like this. When in reality, like when you read a nonfiction book, you just have a tentative belief that might not even be true in like a year from now. And arguably you've wasted your time where the other person's just maximize their pleasure. So I think some of the consequences of reading will be actually suffering or misfortune. And I think that's something you have to accept in the same way that Buddhism teaches you that like living, the consequences of living will be suffering on some level. Maybe not all of the consequences, but at least some of them. So yeah, I think Buddhism and reading are actually very similar. And now when I read, I try and relate some of the principles of Buddhism back to what I'm doing. Like One of the guys I listen to when he lectures about the meditative state, like meditation, sometimes he encourages people to do it with their eyes open, and he says when you get bored, like think about that, and don't try and like run away from it, or don't try and disparage it. Just witness it. And so, like for example, when I'm reading now, if I've found that my threshold for like reading is maybe an hour to an hour and 20 minutes before I start to feel a little bit different. But if I've now, like when I witnessed that happening, I can go further because I don't feel like I need to actually fix that feeling, and I don't feel like I need to get rid of it. Yeah, it's really changing how I read. And I can imagine that even for like, for example, like I have a piano down here. If I play piano, it's probably the same way. If I take a lot of the lessons from Buddhism, I could probably apply it to the piano. I could probably apply it to chess. I don't think I can apply it to math, only because math is very meta. And it's hard for me to think about Buddhism while I'm doing math. Usually when I'm doing math, I'm thinking about the algorithms that I'm using to solve a problem. And so I'm a bit in my head. I'm not like rooted and like self-aware. Maybe I could do it with math. Maybe it's just a skill issue and there's like a learning curve. I think maybe not with math. Anything that's where it's like too meta and requires too much thinking about thinking, it's harder to use Buddhism to do. Whereas like with reading, piano, or chess, it's not that difficult. I don't know. Maybe that's a skill issue. But yeah, I'd love to know what you think about this. And if you have any principles from Buddhism that you use, not only like for reading, but on a day-to-day basis, I'd be interested to see that. But anyways, until next time, bye-bye.